And the person I'm about to introduce is an old friend of ours, Michael Cullinane. He came all the way from Ireland for this because we wanted him back. We love his work. He was here before. In fact, the film that he has produced about the T.R. Island, the national memorial to Roosevelt in the Potomac for the 50th anniversary of that monument, is something that sort of was incubated here in discussions that we had subsequent to his lecture here I think 6 years ago. And when Sharon and I were thinking about this symposium, how do you assess the legacy? We said immediately, we have to have Michael Cullinane here because he has written this book, which I so heartily recommend to you. It's won awards. It's called Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon. Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon. And I don't know if this is quite true, Michael, but it sort of reminds me of a book written by Merrill Peterson called the Thomas Jefferson in American History, which was a groundbreaking book that tried to assess how Jefferson was perceived decade by decade following his death. It's a masterful work, and I think it had a role in your own thinking. So how does America chosen to remember Roosevelt in film, in song, in statuary, in the monuments around the country, including the one that you see the exhibit on here in the hallway, the Roosevelt Memorial in Deadwood? How has America chosen to think about this man? And this is a time when we're thinking a lot about him because it's the centennial, and so I'm just so eager to hear what you have to say, Michael. Michael is a professor of U.S. history at the University of Roehampton in London. As you can see from the brochure, he attended Pace University in New York City, moved to Ireland where he got his MA and PhD from the University of College Cork. He's prolific. We just absolutely love to have him around, and this book, Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, is the basis on which we thought our way through this symposium. Please welcome Michael Cullinane.
Hello. It's good to be back, and thanks to Clay, Sharon, and everyone else, Eric, for driving me around, because I have no car, obviously. Clay's right. This place is an incubator. It's helped me conceive this book. It's helped me conceive the documentary, and it's with conversations with people in this room that these ideas have come to pass. So I hope you'll enjoy today's presentation, which really takes up this idea about who is Roosevelt and how can we ever know him. I don't think you're going to be happy with the answer, which is I don't think we can ever know him. It's impossible. And I rarely start any lectures with a quote, but I wanted to, actually there's a lot of quotes, so that's bad news too there. There's a few quotes in the presentation, including one that I start off with, which I think is really important. It got me stuck in a rabbit hole of sorts, thinking about our imagination and our psychology and how we think about the past. And I think what this quote does is it sums up my idea of what history is, about what human understanding is, and also what Theodore Roosevelt is all about as a person, as a memory, as an image. The quote's from a guy called Robert Fulham. You may know him. He wrote a book 30 years ago that's quite famous called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And it's brimming with wisdom, and this is a man who has a strange ability to distill life into very pithy words. And he says that this is his ethos, this quote I'm about to show you. And I think that's remarkable for a man who can distill things to such few words and have such great meaning, that this is actually his ethos. So let's see if this works. There we go. So he says, I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts. And the reason why I love these lines is that I don't think our past can ever be recovered. Even if we have lived through moments, our memories are not a perfect means of recapturing the past. History is fiction, it's our imagination, it's our memories, and we know how fallible our memories can be. And that means that Theodore Roosevelt is gone. He does not exist anymore, other than in our imagination. He cannot be perfectly recovered. What we read about Roosevelt is an impression of what once was, and that's it, just an impression. And I think that's tough to grapple with a little bit, because we think of history sometimes as being a true reflection of the past. I don't want to dispel that completely, but I do want to dispel it to a certain extent with these two figures. Robin Williams, who starred as Theodore Roosevelt in A Night at the Museum, and that's Edmund Morris on the right, of course, who wrote a famous trilogy about Theodore Roosevelt. He's a biographer. Now, both of these images try to recover Roosevelt. One, obviously, is blatant fiction. In fact, Robin Williams says to Ben Stiller in the film at one stage, he says, "I'm made of wax, Larry." Just to let you know that this isn't real. Edmund Morris obviously doesn't do that with biography. He takes from documents, letters, and testimonials to try and present an accurate past. But you'll know that Edmund Morris as well is a fiction writer. In fact, in his last book, Colonel Roosevelt, he starts with a fictionalized chapter. And in his biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, he inserts himself into the White House. It's complete fiction, and it's very controversial work. Nigel Hamilton, who is a prolific biography writer himself, as well as someone who's written about the history of biography, said that biography is one of the embattled front lines in the struggle between society's notions of truth and imagination. And as a crafty writer, that Morris is, or Hamilton is as well, they cannot reproduce the past as it was, and they only offer us an impression of the past. The movies, even documentaries, are all the same. They cannot faithfully reproduce the past as it happened. What we have is interpretation, speculation, and as Fulham suggests, our imagination will always win out over our knowledge. So the inaccessibility of the past, though, it makes it seem quite dour and downbeat here that I'm saying that we can't get to the past. But I think it's the opposite. I want to get excited about this because in reality, I think we should cherish the idea that we can't understand the past because we get to write it. Right now, we are going to be able to rethink the past in a way that is ours. Theodore Roosevelt belongs to us in this room. And he has done, I would argue, for the last 100 years, or since he died on January 6, 1919. And I'm going to try and prove it to you today by the time we're done. On the fateful day that Roosevelt died, James Earl Fraser, a sculptor, traveled to Oyster Bay, Long Island, to sculpt a death mask of Roosevelt. And he arrived at the invitation of Edith Roosevelt, who wanted this death mask cast. He climbed the stairs to where the dead man lay, bringing with him plaster and knives, spoons, and Vaseline to apply the plaster to Roosevelt's face. After an hour, this is what he produced. He also cast plaster molds of Roosevelt's fingers and hands so that future generations would be able to produce accurate representations of Roosevelt's contours. This ghoulish mask was the first posthumous image of Roosevelt, and it is literally created from the contours of the man it sought to portray. In other words, it's almost completely unadulterated by the artist's imagination. But it wasn't Roosevelt. And those that attended the funeral that day knew it. They renounced the mask as an unrecognizable likeness, denying that Fraser was able to capture the real Roosevelt. And when the poet Frank Owen Payne studied the mold, he dictated his impression in prose. He wrote, "Can this be your face, this whose calm repose portrays no presence but cold, dreamless sleep? This is not you, this bit of smooth, still earth, for you walk straight away to the throne above and ask God cheerily, what's to do up here?" Now, Fraser's cast is my proof to you that the past cannot be recovered for the present. Any portrayal of Roosevelt, no matter how closely connected to the man himself, even if it sat upon his dead face, falls short of a perfect reproduction. The death mask lacked Roosevelt's soul. One of my favorite reactions to Roosevelt's death comes from the era's greatest philosopher and reformer, John Dewey, who was a contemporary of Roosevelt's. He did work with Roosevelt on the 1912 Progressive Campaign, although he didn't agree with Roosevelt on much beside the social welfare policies. So like Jeff was saying about the bellicosity of Roosevelt, this is something that Dewey found quite uncomfortable. But he joined the grieving multitude and contributed, in my mind, what is one of the most noteworthy eulogies of Roosevelt. He believed that the public would remember a personalized image of Roosevelt, one that venerated part but not all of him. The compulsion to recall facets of his life, rather than the totality, Dewey said, came from a natural urge to impose contemporary context and personal desires on the memories of the past. He defined commemoration as inherently subjective. There we go. inherently subjective, one that reflects the aspirations of those who remember. And Dewey prophesies that a Roosevelt double would emerge, a doppelganger of sorts, created from subjective memorialization rather than objective reality. And he said this: "Of every man who goes into political life, there gradually grows up a double. The double consists of the acts of the original individual, reflected first in the imagination, then in the desires and acts of other men." And I love that, because you still have something of Roosevelt in there, that he did something, but then we have misshapen that and contorted it into a legacy. Dewey said that the Roosevelt double would grow particularly immense over time because his capture of the imagination of his countrymen was so complete. And there we have that word again, imagination, our imagination. The concoction of a Roosevelt double took no time at all. In fact, at the funeral, the mourners that were there paired their grief with disappointment, judging that Roosevelt's death passed by all too prosaically. The naturalist Carl Ackley, who wanted to memorialize Roosevelt with a concrete lion in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., he said that it seemed too casual, and he insisted that Roosevelt was too great a man to be buried at Oyster Bay. This was a man for the world, for the nation at least, not for this small enclave in Long Island. And Ferdinand Iglehart, who was the pastor of the New York City Park Avenue Methodist Church, said that for those that knew Roosevelt personally, no monument was needed, that you would experience the Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. But for the later generations that hadn't known him personally, a tall shaft or monument must be created to ensure that they know how he lived and wrought for us. And so a century-long memorial campaign was started days after Roosevelt died, 2 days after Roosevelt died, to enshrine his legacy in some permanent fashion. And it's produced a countless number of images, reproductions, replicas, invocations, co-options, monuments, memorials, tributes, encomiums. The list goes on and on. The book could have been 1,000 pages. But I make the case in the book that the more interpretation we have of Roosevelt, the more images that we have, the closer we get to him, even if they're ludicrous, and some of them are ludicrous. Miley Cyrus has a tattoo on her arm of the man in the arena speech, and she had her husband, one of the Harmsworths, I can't remember his name, they're divorced anyway now, he has the other half of the quote on his arm. Cadillac run commercials with Theodore Roosevelt quotes. I mean, it does get pretty absurd, and I'll take you down that rabbit hole a little later in this presentation as well, to how absurd things can get. But I don't believe in discrediting these representations. Even the most ludicrous have some meaning and importance to us. And that is because it stems from our imagination, which fits into a wider zeitgeist. And that's what makes us all contributors to Roosevelt's legacy. And yet, at the same time, as we're getting closer to understanding Roosevelt through the sane and sometimes insane impressions, we are never going to get to the end. We are never going to fully be able to get an authentic image of Roosevelt, just as James Earl Fraser couldn't construct a true image of Roosevelt from his dead face. And this is where I get to talk about Jay and Ding Darling a little bit more, and I'm delighted that that Rick and Clay warmed up the audience for this one, because this is my favorite Roosevelt cartoon. And it's one that I was really lucky to find an oral history from J. Ding Darling about what was going on that day that he drew this cartoon. And it's almost exactly as Rick had pointed out. I'm just only going to add a little bit of depth to it, really. But his testimony about this cartoon, I think, demonstrates the precarious position that we're in as agents of legacy. Darling's editor came to him the morning that Roosevelt died and asked him to, within 2 hours, produce a cartoon that would go on the front page of the newspaper. And the artist, who was close, as we've heard already, was close with Roosevelt. They were both conservationists. They were both progressive-minded men of a certain time. He admitted that morning he suffered what he called an emotional coma, which is, I think, the same for a writer as a writer's block. He couldn't think of anything to draw that morning because this was, in his own words, a subject that demanded the supreme effort. He blanked. And unable to think of anything at all, he drew something from two memories. One was what Rick had already mentioned, was this previous cartoon that he had done, and the other was from the last meeting he had with Theodore Roosevelt, which was at Oyster Bay when they were riding colts he remembers waving goodbye to Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt lifting his hat off his head and waving goodbye to him. And so he penciled this ethereal figure on horseback, waving goodbye, but he found it unfitting, and so he tossed it to the ground. And he started on another sketch, and he tossed that one to the ground, and the next one after that, and after that. And as the man sat there exhausted, about 1 hour and 45 minutes into his deadline, he looked back down at the floor, and he sees peeking up at him Roosevelt waving goodbye, that top half of the cartoon. And he looked at it from a different perspective. He was now sitting up. He's not drawing anymore. He's part of the audience in a sense already. And looking at that, he thought, well, this is not Roosevelt waving goodbye to me. This is Roosevelt waving goodbye to the nation, or maybe even the entire world. And so he picked it up and he sketched in the Trail of Pioneers and the Capitol, which is in the background there, to try and give a bit of context to Roosevelt's life. And then he brought it over to his editor for the editor to give his approval as he expected. But the editor didn't. He said, this is terrible. This is not your best work. And he said, we're not going to run it. And instead, he told Darling that he was going to run just a plain photo of Roosevelt with a black rim around the edges. And Darling said, yeah, you're right. This isn't good enough. And the editor went to his staff, his assistant, and said, get me a photo of Roosevelt. And they said, we don't have any. They all got burned in a fire a few years ago. And so he went back to Darling and said, we're going to go with this. It's a great piece of work. And they eventually published it, obviously, and it became a monumental piece of work for Darling. He picked up the newspaper that morning, and he happened upon that familiar silhouette of the mounted apparition that was printed, all around the country, is syndicated and made into etchings and book editions. It is Darling's best recognized work. He called it The Long, Long Trail. It almost never made it to print, and Darling's intense reflection left him despondent and unconvinced of his own capabilities. Yet the image is one that Americans related to lovingly. No portrayal could epitomize Darling's affection for Roosevelt, and while he felt relieved that the cartoon caught at least some of the aspects of the man that he knew, he realized that Roosevelt's image now belongs to the public. And he said it wasn't what it should have been. Interestingly, one of the readers of the newspaper that day, there was comment in this oral history as well, he said it was most dramatic. You don't need a caption. You don't need to write anything, which kind of goes back to what Rick and Clay were talking about yesterday. The simplest of cartoons are often the most dramatic. And he said the public can see Roosevelt as they want to see him. Now, I love Darling's frustration because it's my frustration too. The greatest lie that I think we tell ourselves, and many of us will have done this, is that we know what Roosevelt would do. And I certainly put myself in that company. I can't tell you how many times I've said, oh, Roosevelt would have done this, or he would have loved that. And, Clay and I have talked about memorials, what TR would have thought about this memorial or that memorial. But the truth is, we'll never know if TR would like something or not. We'll never know if TR would be a supporter of Donald Trump, as Mike Pence has suggested he would be. Or whether he would be a fan of gay rights, as Lance Bass, a member of NSYNC, has said that he would be. Or whether he would support civil rights, or a Muslim travel ban, or whether he liked Robin Williams in A Night at the Museum. It's our imagination that leads us to conclude what TR would be in the 21st century. But again, let's not poke too much fun at our imagination. Let's not be despondent that we'll never be able to truly understand the past or perfectly understand Roosevelt in our time or in his. There are some things we know for certain. Dates, events, even legislation marks the place where TR occupied history, and that will not change, even if how we conceive him in the present is in constant flux. And there's much to learn from the reception of historical icons like Roosevelt. As Clay pointed out, Merrill Peterson has written two books, in fact, about Jefferson, one about Lincoln. There's others, like Greenberg has written a book on Nixon's shadow. I'm not the first to do this. There's real value in understanding the reception of historical icons. And I make the case that Roosevelt's legacy can teach us about society and ourselves and show us the true value of history as a study that is as vital as engineering, medicine, and the sciences. Now, I think that maybe is not something that comports with everyone about the humanities. The humanities has been under fire in the United States, in the UK, in Ireland, all over the world for years. But obviously, as a professor of history, I have to justify my existence. But I do believe that the humanities are critically important. And I think Roosevelt leads us to the answer why. But before we get there, let me tell you about Carl Becker. You might know as an early 20th century historian. He also believed wholeheartedly in the subjectivity of history. He once said that historians make the dead perform whatever tricks it finds necessary for its own peace of mind, which I love because that's way more eloquent than the last 15 minutes of me rambling on about this. He said it in one short, pithy thing. But I think my presentation makes that point. I also think that it shouldn't make us despondent, as I said. And Carl Becker had this to say about the value of history, that it is indeed not scientific, but moral. By liberalizing the mind, by deepening the sympathies, by fortifying the will, it enables us to control not society, but ourselves. It prepares us to live more humanely in the present and to meet, rather than foretell, the future. To meet the future, not forecast the future. And this is, in fact, what I tell students and parents who visit my campus when they are considering a degree in history. And of course, parents naturally ask, what is my son or daughter going to do with a degree in history after they graduate? So, I tell them, your kids are going to make vital contributions to the progress of society, and all the while they will enrich their own personal lives. And it's about halfway through that their eyes glaze over, and they start thinking, this guy lives in an ivory tower. He has no idea what the real world is like. And so I pivot. I tell them that my graduates include members of the House of Commons, the inventors of Apple products, plural. They include partners at law firms, teachers, journalists, musicians, and circus acts. How many medicine schools produce circus acts? And so I don't quote Carl Becker to parents. It's a little bit more abstract when they're talking or thinking about the future. I quote Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1913, after he left the White House, wrote an essay entitled History as Literature on the interdisciplinary nature of humanities scholarship. And in that essay, he expounds on the necessity of our imagination. Imagination is the key to humanity, he writes. It's the key to historical writing. And that such writing can be, in his own words, he says, a permanent contribution to the sum of man's wisdom, enjoyment, and inspiration. And further to this point on the value of history, Roosevelt insists that wisdom received in one generation might come to naught in the next. And that's fine. But the greatest historian should also be a great moralist. And I think we heard that actually from Jeff in his talk about humanity and how that comes out in his read of World War I. And it's exactly what I've tried to do as a historian. I think it's what memorializers try to do when they think about the past. When we interpret Roosevelt, we do so based on our own moral compass and in our own given time. So let me explain this a little bit further through a story about our imagination of Roosevelt and the divided character of American nationalism. One of the most prominent images of Roosevelt at the time of his death was that of a patriotic American. So actually, what I should say is the most eminent theme in Roosevelt's memory in 1919 is American and Americanism. Okay, so that I'll explain what that really means, but this is an Edwin Marcus cartoon that I really adore because it captures the feeling of what America thought of Roosevelt and how history would remember him. It's Cleo, the muse of history, writing on the tablet of the past what Roosevelt will mean. And it's not president, although of course he represented the nation. It's not the outdoorsman or the conservationist. It is the American. Now, what that really means at this time in 1919 is Roosevelt is a man who supported intervention in World War I, that urged preparedness, that despised communism, that eschewed disorder and faithfully believed in the United States as a city upon a hill, as John Winthrop had originally said, and all of the ideology that surrounds that, civic and otherwise. This image saw TR as a proponent of American internationalism and of the United States remaking the world again in its own image. At home, it had different connotations, though. Americanism is a kind of dog whistle politics. It still is a kind of dog whistle politics. At the time, in 1919, it invoked anti-immigrant biases. Patriotism and nationalism obviously signal pride in oneself and one's nation, but it also signifies that others are not as good as ourselves. It is an us and them sort of diametric. Anyway, this divided character of American nationalism is central to Roosevelt's legacy. At once, it promises equality to all Americans while simultaneously demanding that immigrants discard their identities to be pure Americans, whatever that is. Now, what we can glean from these divergent impressions of Roosevelt is quite a bit. I believe the reason why Roosevelt is popular today as well as back then is that his legacy inhibits these conflicting philosophies, like those found in the divided character of American nationalism. The legacy theme of Americanism was so dominant in the politics of Roosevelt's at the time of Roosevelt's death that a group of women sought to rebuild Roosevelt's birthplace on East 20th Street in Manhattan as a foundation for Americanism. And we're going to think a little bit about that later on tonight, which is great. This is a really remarkable story of a monument and a memorial to TR. The center it was designed to train immigrants in the ideology of American democracy and produce anti-communist literature to stave off the seeming coercion of America's youth in 1919. This is a time when the fear of Bolshevism is very real. We had 2 Red Scares. This is the first one, of course, and these women raised millions of dollars on the basis that they were going to save the United States from a clear and present threat of communism. However, the first Red Scare subsided within 2 years. By 1921, it had all but evaporated, as did the need for this foundation, and the organization could barely support its activities after that Red Scare had passed over. Now, conversely, at the same time in 1919, you have some of the most prominent tributes to Roosevelt are made by rabbis and priests, ministers, clergy. In homily after homily, these preachers talk about Roosevelt's tolerance for religions, and specifically a tolerance for immigrants and from non-Protestant faiths. Roosevelt's capacity to embrace immigrants, maybe not en masse, but in some regard, and sometimes non-white immigrants, stemmed from his Americanism as well. His faith that the American creed was embracing, that it took in others and it made them American, granted equality and freedom to those. If you wanted to be part of the American experiment, you could. So in short, Americanism mobilized 2 very different groups, and Roosevelt served as the icon for both of them. Now, in American politics, the same today is the case. It's been the case. Actually, Donald Trump is the only president not to invoke Theodore Roosevelt's name in a major speech. Every president since his death in 1919 has done so. And that's Democrats, Republicans, that's even within primary battles. In 1920, for example, Roosevelt was all over that election despite the fact that he died. Every single Republican invoked his name. The Democrats actually nominated Roosevelt to be vice presidential candidate. And if we take that all the way up to the 20th and 21st century, people like Dick Gephardt, when he decided to run for president in 1988, did so by printing off loads of cloth red bandanas that looked exactly like TR's 1912 bandanas. Across the aisle, his nemesis, Newt Gingrich, was invoking TR even more fervently and still does to this day, having written books about him. Barack Obama went to Kansas to launch the Affordable Care Act, doing so the same place where John Brown and the new nationalism really took root in American consciousness. Even as party systems change, TR remains a bipartisan favorite of politicians. Now, even among Roosevelt family members, the meaning of TR is disputed, and that's tough. That's got to be tough on families. I visited Holland a few times where the Roosevelts hail from, and they say that there's a peace treaty that happened in Middleburg between these 2 conflicting clans of Roosevelts. But it was after this first generation died out. They simply did not agree on what TR meant in the afterlife. And that's really characterized by the woman in the bottom picture there. That's Alice Roosevelt Longworth, his eldest daughter from a previous marriage. And Alice and her brother Ted, who's pictured on top there, TR's namesake, they feuded for decades with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife and their cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, over the true meaning of TR's legacy. Was he a big government progressive, or was he a small government anti-New Dealer? Alice made the case, and Ted did, for him being an anti-New Dealer. And of course, the New Deal was branded on the very same identity as the Square Deal. So Franklin Roosevelt was laying his claim as well. In terms of foreign policy, Alice made the case that TR was an isolationist, which I think is ludicrous. But, you know, she knew him better than I did. In the 1920s, she advocated against the League of Nations, and then later would join the America First Committee as one of its most influential members. Of course, FDR interpreted TR as an internationalist and branded himself as such, bringing into his cabinet in the 1940s men like Henry Stimson, who in 1910 Theodore Roosevelt supported to be governor, and men like Frank Knox, who also served with TR. So it's confusing, even for family members. And it gets even more confusing still. Archie Roosevelt, who's pictured there on the left, is TR's youngest living son. And he had a really confused understanding of Roosevelt. He saw him as a kind of segregationist, akin to George Wallace, a populist kind of man, and wrote about him as such in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. I'm sure that's an image that many of us do not associate with TR. But this is the confused nature, even within the family, of Roosevelt's legacy. But rather than finish on the divisions that Roosevelt prompts, I want to wrap up with the one thing I believe all of these memorials share, which is his humanity. Whether you love him or loathe him, you can't help but laugh with TR. And I think comedy and Roosevelt's capacity for comedy is perhaps his most human impulse. Among other things, he could laugh at himself. And there was the story about the book that Finley Peter Dunne had suggested he name his Rough Riders book, Alone in Cuba. When Roosevelt heard that, he laughed out loud, and he invited Finley Peter Dunne to the White House. Now think about that for a moment in our day and age, a president that can take a joke. I mean, that is astonishing. And I think it shows an embrace of all of the things that he can be. That he embraced those things, I mean, really. Now, in the same way that we talked about cartoons and satirists, I want to share a recent instance of posthumous commemoration that styles worship and contempt in a singular portrayal of Roosevelt, all told through humor. So I don't know if anyone has seen the play Rose of Elvis, but if you do get a chance, I can recommend it. It was originally performed in 2015 by a Brooklyn theater collective called The Team. And what The Team is dedicated to do is reinterpreting the American experience in a way that can be brought to the masses. And they staged a play called Rose of Elvis. Now, I will spare you the convoluted plot, and it is very convoluted. Suffice to say that Elvis and Theodore Roosevelt are two competing personalities within a troubled woman who is grappling with her identity. They are hilarious personalities. Elvis is a softly spoken stud that comes off as somewhat bashful in comparison to Roosevelt, who is portrayed as a prude, eager to please Victorian. Christian Se, who plays Roosevelt, you can see her with the mustache there. You might not recognize her, but she's been in such television shows as Boardwalk Empire and House of Cards, so she's quite an established actress. She said, "I have great admiration for him being Roosevelt, and therefore approach playing him with warmth and empathy rather than any kind of ironic remove. That said, he's definitely a clown. He throws himself into everything with absolute commitment." Now, I can't do the impersonations any justice, so I thought I would find something to show you that can give you a sense of how interpretations of Roosevelt are shaping up in the 21st century. And so I'm going to show you a clip of this, of these two characters, these two actors in character. Now, they're not dressed up, but I think you'll get a sense from this of how depiction and portrayal is the direction of travel, I should say.
I was born in New York, New York.
I moved to Memphis when I was 14.
I went to Harvard when I was 17.
I graduated high school. I got a job driving a truck. I was training to become an electrician.
I ran for New York State Assembly, and I got it. I was only 23.
Oh, I was 19 the first time they played me on the radio. They played me 11 times in a row that night, and folks started calling in and going, "Who's that?" So Dewey Phillips called my house. He wanted me to come down to the station for an interview. First question he asked me when I got there was, what high school did I go to? So folks listening would know I was a white guy. Because really, I was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. I mean, I really shook things up, man. I never wrote any songs that I sung.
I wrote 45 books, not including journals published posthumously. I wrote in my journal nearly every day, editing as I went. I was also a voracious reader, read tens of thousands of books, sometimes 3 a day. I can have a conversation with anyone about anything. I'm a part of everything I ever read.
Well, if I hadn't been an entertainer, I would have liked to have been a sheriff.
If I hadn't been the President of the United States, I would have gone into natural sciences. I love animals. I love to categorize things and dissect them. When I was president, the White House was full of pets.
Oh, I had a chimpanzee named Scatter. He knew how to drive.
I had a horse named Manitou.
Oh, I had a horse named Bear. I love Christmas and lasagna and meat.
I love my family, the 4th of July, meat, and guns.
Oh, I like to carry a gun.
Me too, very much. I have many guns.
I like to carry a gun right here.
Well, we're seeing, and the humor is important, I think. It gives you a sense of, I think, well, I don't know what Roosevelt would think about these things, and I want to delve into that for a moment, but there's a line that Christian Sess says there where, as Roosevelt, she says, I'm a part of everything I ever read. And I think that's a nice way to think about what Roosevelt, how he engaged with his world, with his times. One of the playwrights of Roosevelt Elvis, a guy by the name of Jape Margolin, said that the play's inspiration stemmed from regular conversations about how we see ourselves in constant relation to icons of greatness, regardless of our own potential, regardless of, if you can ever become president, regardless of that, can you look up to them? Can you be inspired by them? And Margolin wondered whether Teddy Roosevelt and Elvis Presley pictured themselves through the eye of the camera and whether they heard a score for their internal biopics. And I think we all know that TR did. I mean, this image right here is case in point. He wanted to be a cowboy, and so he made it so. He dressed himself in that outfit, and he promoted himself in such a way that he was producing his image. Roosevelt, for example, also around this idea of masculinity, which is very much a part of this play, as you can imagine. He crafted an image of him as a manly man. And there's part of that might be true, but there's a big part of that that's just nonsense. And it's about producing an image of himself that is going to look like that. For example, he was terrible at sports. I don't know if you realize how bad he was at sports. I mean, for a man who prided himself on horseback riding, which he was excellent at, he was a terrible tennis player, and he loved tennis. That was his favorite sport. He never let anyone take a photo of him because a tennis costume, he believed, was effeminate, and it didn't give off the right vibe. In fact, he told William Howard Taft in 1908 when he was running for president, do not let anyone see you playing golf. They will get the wrong impression. He wasn't good at baseball. He didn't play football. The idea of masculinity in Roosevelt still needs to be teased out further. He has become a caricature of the manly man, but he was far more complex than that. What historical characters occupied his inner monologue? Well, given the fact that he wrote 3 biographies, I wonder, did people like Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Hart Benton, and Gouverneur Morris, did they factor in his impression of himself? And we can make a guess at those 3, or maybe we include the heroes of the Nibelungenlied, the Norse myths, King Olaf, and the likes of those. In any case, I think this raises potential for further studies into legacy and reception of TR. Instead of how we have interpreted him over the last 100 years, how did Roosevelt see himself through the heroes that he idolized? Roosevelt's strenuous life involved so much, from exploring nature to reading literature and learning languages. He understood the importance of humanities more broadly as intellectual pursuits that sharpened his mind, prepared him for what might come, and perhaps most important of all, made him mindful of the ever-present moment and those around him. He was mindful, which is quite a 21st century term. History gave Roosevelt focus. It gave him empathy. It gave him a sense of scale, that his life fit into a wider tapestry of existence and meaning. Roosevelt's ghost appears in all quarters of American lives. John Allen Gable, the former director of the Roosevelt Association, called TR the mythic Roosevelt because he surpassed the real Roosevelt that day that he died in 1919. The myth, or as the ghost as I call it, it's evolved continuously since then. Legacy themes in 1919, like Americanism, emanated from memorializers who considered Roosevelt from their perspective in their time, and consequently his image has gone through many transformations. The only apparent constant we have is his popularity. He remains as germane today as he did a century ago. The impression of him may mutate, and in the 21st century, it has definitely gotten strange. But until the time when his memory is entirely insignificant, something that seems completely unlikely to me, Roosevelt's ghost will continue to inspire debate and make us think about his likeness and how we can interpret him in our time. I've equated him, if I have to pick another cartoon, to a grinning Cheshire cat. And you probably remember the Cheshire Cat is from Alice in Wonderland, and the Cheshire Cat would enter the scene, eyes and teeth first, smiling, and then would depart, eyes and teeth last. That would be the last lingering image you would see of the Cheshire Cat. When he fades in, you don't know what you're going to see. You just know that the teeth and the eyes are there and something's coming. And when he fades out, you wonder what might come next. And I think TR is very much that same grinning character who comes in and out of our consciousness in various ways over various times, just like a Cheshire Cat. Thanks.
So can you talk a little bit about the formation, Roosevelt's self-formation? We know that he was a sickly child, that he read those Mayne Reid books about the white buffalo hunter and the boy hunters and so on. Talk about how he was formed and formed himself.
Yeah, I mean, that story's been told, I mean, by various biographers over the ages. It's been told in monuments like the birthplace, where you can see the equipment that he used, the gym equipment that he used to try and remake his body. I mean, those stories are there and they're real. It's a question of how deep you want to delve into them and how they change over time. There's stories, too, that we don't often hear in those biographies about his youth, for example. When he went to Italy as a boy with his father, and they taunted young Italian children with food. I mean, there's stories that we haven't really grappled with yet. This is a complex man who is living, like all of us, in times that are sometimes hard to explain. Definitely now, I think, are sometimes hard to explain. But we can't get a handle on that. It doesn't matter how many biographies we write. It doesn't matter what aspects of Roosevelt that we decide to highlight. And those are all choices as well, I think. If you decide to focus on his asthma and remaking himself, and just that, at the exclusion of other things in his childhood, you're not getting the full picture.
So that's in a way, I'm using this term not as a negative thing, but that's a Roosevelt myth. That's a narrative we've created of the little boy whose father said, you must overcome your physical problems and make your body. You think maybe we've given that more centrality than it deserves?
So I don't think they knew what they were doing. I don't think that they knew that they were going to fix his asthma. I mean, that's something that they couldn't have known. I mean, they gave him cigars as a child to try and fix the asthma. You know, whether the exercise or the cigars worked, I think this is a part of his life, just like we have events and moments and episodes in our life that are very much transformational, formational for us. We can think of them right now. You're probably thinking of moments in your life that are transformational. I think we should focus on them, that they're important, they're part of history and part of the past, but there are others surrounding those that need to be as thoroughly digested, maybe.
But when we create a national mythology of Buffalo Bill or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, in this case Roosevelt, they're tenacious. Mm-hmm. They're very tenacious. And even though you might nibble around the edges and say, this is a thing we need to look more at, or here's a nuance that we haven't paid enough attention to, mm-hmm. There's that tenacity of the national memory. Mm-hmm. And so is it really possible to revisit Roosevelt? You said he's elusive. We can't actually get at him.
I think he's a bar of soap in your hand, and the harder you grip your hand, he slips out every time. And I think the national myth is like that too. We create a national myth often to give a sense of identity to our causes often, and that can change, and it has changed from generation to generation. There's been some national myths that are no longer a part of us. We used to salute the flag with the Roman salute up until 1948. We don't do that anymore for good reason, I think. So these myths, these rituals that we undertake, they change. They're a part of us. They are the decisions that we make on a daily basis about how to construct the world around us and how to understand it, digest it, engage with it.
So I want to go back to one of the slides here, but first look over your shoulder there at that Roosevelt. We chose that, which we're North Dakota, so Hawaii might not have chosen that image if they were doing a symposium. We're very proud of that. That's a self-fashioning that Roosevelt went through. Yep. He came out as a dude, overdressed, over-fastidious, over-eager, but it worked. And if you looked at those cartoons or any of the thousands of cartoons of Roosevelt, he's more often pictured in Rough Rider costume or in cowboy costume than any other thing, even though these were episodes. So I remember when Leonard Nimoy was older, he wrote a book saying, "I am not Spock."
Right.
He did not want to be locked into Spock, but Roosevelt did not mind at all being this person.
Well, it served his purpose. I mean, it allowed him to engage with a part of the country that he never would have been able to do so. In other ways, he tried to make himself a Southerner, and that never worked out. He didn't have the icons, and this goes back to the cartoons as well, the icons of the West, the cowboy hat, the sheriff's badge, the chaps, and the tassels, even though the tassels apparently weren't a part of that.
No real cowboy wore them.
Yeah, but he knew that putting those tassels on created this image that people in the East particularly would understand, they would engage with. And the people of the West, I think he probably had to earn that in a different way. This image, I wonder in North Dakota, they called him Four Eyes at one stage, didn't they, when they met him? And he talked funny. He talked like a New York aristocrat. But he proved himself here. He earned respect here. But this image is for the rest of the country. This image is for the Eastern aristocrats, to show that he's different, that he has another angle. Just like his southernness with his mother, he tried to promote that idea of him being Southern in some way. There's no Southernness in Theodore Roosevelt. He's a New Yorker from birth, and as Ted Cohn says in his book, he's a New Yorker at death as well. This is a facet of him. It's an episode in his life. It's important to the construction of his own personal image, but that's what it is.
I want to bring the audience in, but go back to that cartoon of the Muse of History.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so what's crossed out?
Got President...
Statesman?
Yeah, statesman, soldier, historian, explorer, naturalist, and orator.
He's all of those things.
He's all of those things.
But those don't sum him up.
No.
But at this time, that was said to sum him up. But it's a largely amorphous and loose term.
Well, it's a political reason why this is... So, in fact, when the Roosevelt Memorial Association meet up, I've read all of their executive minutes, which is incredibly boring, but the first meeting is really engaging. You've got Elihu Root in the room and Herman Hagedorn. Herman Hagedorn is going to become the foremost memorializer of Theodore Roosevelt. The guy for 50 years. He will shape the image of TR. And he's in the room with Elihu Root, Gifford Pinchot, loads of other far more important people for that time. And he says, Hagedorn says, we need to memorialize Roosevelt as an American. And it needs to be tailored to the current trend of anti-Bolshevism and anti-immigrant politics. And Elihu Root says, not a chance. He says that is a fleeting political moment. How you memorialize Roosevelt is through art, so that people can interpret him in later generations. And thankfully, Elihu Root wins the day. I mean, he was a more powerful character at that time. I mean, if Hagedorn had waited 50 years, he would have been the more powerful character. But Root at that time wins the day, and that's why we get impressions of Roosevelt that are far more artistic and much less political. It's the reason why the likes of Barack Obama can invoke him in 2010, and Republicans can too.
But when Representative Gebhardt brought out his scarves, I just felt a kind of a Lloyd Benson moment there. Like, I knew Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
You're no Jack Kennedy. People want that mantle, but it's hard to. McCain is sometimes invoked in this, and others, but almost nobody can really embody this set of character.
I think McCain probably claimed the closest in recent memory. I mean, the idea of a maverick senator, he really hitched his star to that. In fact, in 2000, when McCain and the other 10 Republican nominees were debating, you might remember they asked, the commentator asked, who's your favorite philosopher? And McCain said, Theodore Roosevelt. And I thought, oh, he just nailed that. Well done. And then George Bush said, Jesus. And I thought, oh, that's the right answer.
Trump card.
That's the answer. And, there went the nomination.
Let me ask one more question before I turn to the audience. It's kind of it's a really difficult question, but so now we're living in this sort of time where Confederate statues are coming down, and we're rethinking everything, and Wilson may come down at Princeton because he was a racist and a sexist and so on. Paint was thrown on the statue of TR on equestrian statue at the American Museum of Natural History. There's a move to remove that statue. Undoubtedly, Roosevelt will weather this storm, but how, as a historian of cultural memory, do you assess this moment in our history?
It's the same as any other, I think. I think this is a natural process whereby we're revisiting the past, and we're looking, as you said, at the warts and all, and we're deciding whether it fits with our current understanding of our experience today. And that was a close vote. It was one vote that separated Roosevelt staying in front of the American Museum of Natural History and him going. So he is really on the sort of on the fence here of an acceptable. I think it's more the fact that he's pictured with a Native American, and I think there's another.
So like a Filipino or something.
I think it's a woman.
These are indigenous people that he's bringing into civilization.
So it's a specific memory of Roosevelt and race and empire. That's really. I don't think anyone's suggesting that Roosevelt come down from the inside, where there's talk of him as a conservationist. But that image on the outside really speaks to a different legacy that we're all grappling with, the legacy of empire today.
But he wrote maybe not 45 books, but somewhere between 35 and 40 books. He wrote a ton.
Yeah.
And including the 4-volume Winning of the West.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for reasons to dislike Roosevelt, some of the things he said in Winning of the West about indigenous peoples.
The first line he says there's waste spaces.
Right. And they're not using them.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, if you're looking to discredit Roosevelt, there's plenty of material out there. And right now, some people are wanting to discard him altogether as a white nationalist or as a racist or a race hierarch, eugenics. So how, as a humanities scholar, not necessarily just a historian, but how, as a humanities scholar, do you contextualize and place these sorts of things so that it's a balanced view, but it's not a complacent view?
So the reason why Roosevelt is such a good character to study and why there are so many biographies is because the impression has changed so considerably, but starts off with these quite hagiographical, saintly impressions of Roosevelt in the 20s until you get a revision that looks at Roosevelt as, Crazy Teddy, as he was called by someone. But what we've gotten to with the warts and all approach that the center is taking, but not everyone takes, is that we get a more human picture of Roosevelt. Those flaws make him real. None of us are faultless, and neither is TR. So the more we get to that nuance of good and bad, or just the complexities of human character, the more we like him, I think.
So we have time for just a couple of questions I want to make sure we do. Of course, we have this afternoon for panel discussion and Saturday, but thoughts, questions for Michael Cullinane? The 10 Democrats last night, what would they have said of TR?
Well, Elizabeth Warren's already said that she's a big fan of TR. Hillary Clinton said that as well. I think it's probably harder for Joe Biden, maybe, to relate to another. They put out all their playlists as well, the songs that they're playing. Joe Biden has got more African American singers and songwriters in his playlist, and that's done on purpose. He needs to tether his future to minority populations that just see him as another white man. Elizabeth Warren doesn't have that problem, so she's tethered herself to Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know about the rest of them. I mean, I'm not sure Bernie Sanders has ever invoked Roosevelt or not, but it's interesting. It happens every year. It's like it's par for the course. Roosevelt gets brought out for at least one politician every year. Trump's the only one who hasn't done it.
It'd be fun to reverse the lens. What would he think of those 10?
Yeah.
We won't do that, but it'd be fun. But today a candidate would be unlikely to invoke Jefferson, because Jefferson is so toxic now in the minds of some. Several of the candidates have said that they're edgy about Jefferson. And so you wouldn't want a Jefferson quote on your campaign literature now, but you think TR is still okay.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump, when he found out that Andrew Jackson was a populist, he put a statue of him in the White House. I mean, I didn't think you could get away with, well, I don't think you can get away with a lot, but Donald Trump has gotten away with, changing politics completely. And Andrew Jackson is in the frame now. I mean, this is, the Trail of Tears happened on his watch, and it was encouraged by his party. So anything can happen.
And the point is, he may not have invoked him in speech, but he has iconography sometimes behind an individual.
Yeah, and some of that happens as well. Just in the White House, they changed the images around of the busts. He's got Churchill in the White House now as well. That's an old one that's been brought out. And I think the portrait you're referring to, George W. Bush used to have behind him as well. So these things do the rounds. It's harder to pin down whether the president has an affinity or a feeling, an emotional attachment to that piece of work. I don't know. Does he have an emotional attachment to art? I'm not sure.
Does Donald Trump have a Remington statue in the White House?
I don't know. I mean, he very well could, but I think a lot of the artwork just gets changed around. This is the bucking bronco, is it? Yeah. No, I know the one you're talking about. These things usually are not the sole discretion of the president. The White House staff has ideas about what should be seen. The press team has ideas about what should be seen.
You see how Trump has crept in. If TR were here, he'd say, hey, this is about me. This is about me. Let's get back to me.
You want the attention on him. That's
right. He doesn't want to share. We'll have more chances to talk. Michael Cullinane, thank you.
Thank you.